She never meant to be noticed. Just a quiet little girl, watching her mother clean the home of a man the world called a genius. To him, she was invisible, just the maid's daughter. But when he stumbled over a language no one could understand, a soft voice from the shadows spoke, clear, perfect, and impossible to ignore. In that single moment, everything changed. The room froze, his pride shattered, and the world learned a lesson it should have known long ago. Brilliance has no color, no status, only truth.
It was another quiet morning in the professor's grand house. Walls lined with books, floors that echoed with the weight of intellect. Professor Alcott, a world-renowned linguist, was preparing for yet another interview about his latest discovery, an ancient language even scholars struggled to decode. To him, every sound, every symbol had meaning, except the people who worked around him. And downstairs, Rosa scrubbed the marble floors with quiet dignity. Her hands were rough from years of labor, but her eyes softened each time she glanced toward the open window, where her 10-year-old daughter, Amara, sat with a tattered notebook, whispering words she'd copied from the professor's old journals. And Amara was curious, not in the playful way of most children, but with a hunger that frightened her mother. She listened, memorized, and repeated everything she heard. Yet in this house, her voice was meant to stay silent. The professor's guests came and went, praising his genius while stepping past the girl as though she were invisible. NNBUT that morning, as the professor wrestled with a forgotten dialect, muttering words even he couldn't decipher, Amara's eyes lit up. Something about those symbols felt familiar. Her heart pounded. She shouldn't speak, she knew her place. Yet, for the first time, silence felt heavier than fear. For days, Amara listened in silence as Professor Alcott tried to unlock the ancient script. The sound of his frustration echoed through the house. Papers crumpled, books slammed shut, ink splattering across the table. His team of scholars spoke in circles, offering theories that led nowhere. Impossible, he muttered one afternoon, his voice tight with exhaustion. No human mind could have preserved a language this complex. Namara's small fingers traced invisible letters on the floor as she whispered the symbols under her breath. Her mother caught her once and shook her head sharply. "Don't, Amara. That's not for us." NNBUT. The more she tried to stay quiet, the louder the words grew inside her mind, sounds and meanings connecting like puzzle pieces. Each syllable felt alive. She didn't know how she knew them, she just did. And one evening, as the professor hosted a group of linguists, the air turned thick with frustration. Dozens of translations failed. Pride gave way to panic. And then, by accident, a loose paper slipped from the table, landing near Amara's feet. NNSHE picked it up gently. The symbols danced before her eyes, rearranging themselves into something clear, almost like the page was speaking to her. Without realizing it, she whispered the first line aloud. NNTHE room went silent. And dozens of eyes turned toward her, a little black girl holding a scholar's paper. The professor's face hardened. "What did you just say?" And Amara froze. Her mother's breath caught. She didn't mean, "Repeat it," he demanded. Namara's voice trembled, but the words flowed effortlessly, each sound rolling off her tongue with uncanny precision. The scholars exchanged uneasy glances. How could she know that? One of them whispered, NNTHE. Professor's pride twisted into disbelief, and then irritation. Nonsense. She must have overheard someone, he said sharply, his tone slicing through the air. And Rosa pulled Amara close, her heart pounding. But it was too late. The professor snatched the page from her hand and began testing her, line after line, phrase after phrase. And with every answer, Amara's voice grew steadier, clearer, braver. NNTHE scholars watched in stunned silence. The girl who was supposed to scrub floors was speaking a language no one else in the room could understand. And still, instead of awe, a quiet unease filled the space. The professor's jaw tightened. His voice dropped low. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my colleagues? Pretending to be something you're not?" And tears welled in Amara's eyes. "I wasn't pretending," Rosa stepped forward, her voice shaking. She was only trying to help. NBUT. No one listened. In that grand hall of intellect, her daughter's brilliance wasn't celebrated. It was doubted, dismissed, silenced. NNTHE. Professor turned away. "Take her out of here. This is no place for distractions." As Rosa led Amara toward the door, the girl's eyes lingered on the table, on the words she knew by heart but would never be allowed to speak again. Or so they thought. because later that night, long after the lights went out, the professor sat alone, reading through the notes Amara had corrected. His hands trembled. Every translation she'd spoken was right. NNHE. Stared at the papers, then at the darkened corner of the room where she had stood. Realizing, too late, that the genius he'd been searching for had been standing in front of him all along.
The next morning, the house buzzed with quiet tension. The professor hadn't slept. The truth clawed at his mind. Every word that child had spoken was correct. Every translation flawless. Yet admitting it meant undoing everything he stood for. NNHE called Rosa and Amara into his study. The sunlight poured through tall windows, catching the dust in the air like tiny sparks. Amara stood silently beside her mother, clutching her worn notebook, the one she'd been filling with his words for months. NTHE professor stared at her, his voice sharp but trembling underneath. "Where did you learn that language?" Amara hesitated. "I didn't learn it. I just understood it." NHER answer felt like a mirror held to his pride. His hands slammed the desk. "Do you think this is a game? That you, a maid's child, could outsmart men who've spent their lives studying this?" Rosa's voice cracked. "Sir, please. She meant no harm." And then Amara stepped forward, tears in her eyes, courage in her voice. "You said no human mind could preserve this language. Maybe you were wrong." NTHE room fell silent. For the first time, the professor couldn't speak. Her words struck deeper than he'd expected. Not just at his intellect, but his prejudice. NNHE turned away, pacing, fighting himself. The papers he'd spent years analyzing now looked meaningless in her presence. His colleagues would laugh, the world would question his brilliance, and yet he couldn't deny her truth. Finally, he sank into his chair, his voice breaking. "Read it again." Amara opened the notebook and began to speak. Her small voice filled the room, soft but powerful, each word flowing like music, each phrase unlocking meaning centuries old. NNTHE professor listened, not as a scholar, but as a man finally realizing what he'd refused to see. The maid's daughter wasn't a distraction. She was the discovery. NNBY, the time she finished, tears shimmered in Rosa's eyes. The silence afterward felt holy, heavy with truth. NNTHE professor whispered almost to himself. "All this time, and I never saw her."
Days passed, but that morning's moment never left the professor's mind. He reviewed Amara's notes again and again, every line perfect, every meaning precise. For the first time in his career, he felt humbled and ashamed. NNHE invited Amara and Rosa back into his study, not as servants but as guests. His voice was quieter this time, almost fragile. "Amara," he said, "the world should hear what you've done." Nana Rosa's eyes widened. Amara clutched her notebook tighter, afraid to believe it. Weeks later, at a prestigious language symposium, the professor stood before a crowded hall. Cameras flashed, scholars whispered, and beside him, barely tall enough to reach the microphone, stood the little girl the world had ignored. NNHE cleared his throat. "Today, I'd like to introduce you to the real mind behind this discovery." NNTHE audience went still. And then Amara spoke, calm, clear, brilliant. Her voice carried across the hall, each word echoing the truth her skin had once silenced. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet. Applause thundered. But more powerful than the sound was the shift in the air. The realization that genius doesn't wear a uniform, doesn't need permission, doesn't come with privilege. NNFOR Rosa. It was pride beyond words. For Amara, it was the first time the world truly saw her. And for the professor, it was redemption. A reminder that brilliance is universal, but opportunity is not. NN because for every Amara who is seen, there are countless others who are not. Children whose voices are dismissed before they ever speak. Minds dimmed not by lack of light, but by the shadows others cast upon them. NNSO, the question remains. NHOW, many more will be silenced before the world finally listens?